Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm with the Dexter Arts, Culture, and Heritage Committee, and we commissioned this play. And first thing first, I'd like to thank the Encore Theater for hosting this reading. Very, very generous of them, and really, really appreciate it. It's a great resource for our town, and really cool that they're letting us do this here. Just a brief introduction to what it is that you're going to be seeing here. This is a staged reading, a developmental reading. It's in the process, this is part of the process of developing a play for production, hopefully. And the writer has prepared this. You're going to be seeing selected snippets that sort of create an arc that will show you what the play would be from beginning to end. This isn't the finished product, it's part of the process, and you are a very valuable part of the process, because a play is nothing without the collaboration of the actors, the director, the writer, and the audience. That's where it comes to life. So your reactions and your feedback at the end will help the writer and the director figure out what the next stages are to getting this to production. So thank you very much for your participation today. I know it's a Sunday. Let me introduce the very talented cast we have here today. Julia Glander is playing Katherine. Alexis Benson is playing young Katherine. Jessica Grove is playing Katherine. Marlene Inman is playing multiple roles, including Josephine Dexter. David Hone is playing an attorney. And also Stanley McCormick. Lauren Steiner, being played by Natasha Rodriguez. And critically, stage directions by Dylan Benson. We'll guide through the physical action. Sometimes people will get up and talk, sometimes they'll speak from their seats, but we hope that you'll get a sense of what's going on from beginning to end. The director, Dan Cooney, and our playwright is Dale Ann Hunt. Afterwards, we're going to have a brief discussion if you care to participate. And you all have feedback forms in your programs, and we have pens available for you. It'll be very helpful to all of us if you would take a few minutes to give us your response, and we really appreciate it. And now, KDM, the Katherine Dexter McCormick.
1967, the grounds of Gordon Hall in Dexter, Michigan. A young woman, Lauren Steiner, enters and looks around. Seemingly out of nowhere, a spry, elderly woman appears.
Hello? Oh, hello. Forgive me, I didn't mean to startle you. I'm Mrs. McCormick, the former Katherine Dexter. I presume you're the young MIT student who will be conducting the interview?
I am. Lauren Steiner. It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. McCormick.
Katherine indicates for them to sit on a garden bench.
It's unusually warm for this time of year.
Yes, I've just been admiring the grounds. This is a lovely spot.
My grandfather chose it for its vantage point. Back then, I imagine it afforded a view over the entire village. I was born here, you know, in Gordon Hall. My grandfather,
Judge Samuel Dexter.
That's right. He built this home more than 100 years ago, named it in honor of his mother, Katherine Gordon. I bear her name as well. And I fear these old bones have grown nearly as old as this edifice.
Surely not.
92 years on my last birthday, but you knew that already.
Well, you've had quite a life, Mrs. McCormick.
I suppose I have. Though one doesn't think about these things while living it. It's only later, after it's done. That's when one tends to see things more clearly. But I believe that we were discussing the hall.
Yes.
22 rooms, 9 fireplaces, 52 windows. It's not quite the same since I gave it to the university. But back in 1843,
It must have been magnificent.
I imagine it was. 3 presidents walked through these doors, you know. My father, Wirt Dexter, was actually named for President Monroe's Attorney General. He visited just after my father was born. This home, this village, has quite a history.
So, your grandfather, Judge Samuel, founded Dexter,
He did, and he named the village in honor of his father.
the great lawyer.
I see that you've done your research. But now I'm afraid I'm going to sound like Josephine, my mother. She was completely enthralled with the Dexter family history.
History, indeed!
Josephine enters, pushing a teacup.
Why, the 3rd Samuel Dexter, my Catherine's great-grandfather, served in the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. President John Adams himself appointed him as Secretary of War and then as Secretary of the Treasury. Do you know that he actually developed the first national budget?
Once you got her started, there was no stopping her.
When our very first president passed away, George Washington, of course, it was our own Samuel Dexter who wrote the eulogy. Can you imagine? But when President Jefferson pleaded with him to stay on and serve in his cabinet, the great lawyer declined. He wanted to return to the people and practice law again. Oh dear, what have I done with the sugar spoon? Ah, there it is. Now, I believe it was in 1824 when the great lawyer's son, Judge Samuel Dexter, migrated west and founded the Mill Creek settlement, right there on the banks of the Huron River. That was 13 years before Michigan actually became a state. Oh yes, he was quite the pioneer. I wonder if I shouldn't ring for some more milk after all. Well, after he established the first lumber mill and grist mill and plotted the village, he opened the first post office, and do you know that Judge Samuel personally carried the mail himself every week? Now, I can't say for sure, but I suspect his reason for founding the local newspaper was so he could be more widely express his views on temperance. Oh, yes, Judge Samuel made sure there would be no saloons in the village of Dexter. Of course, it was in 1841, when he helped to bring the railroad through, that the village really began to grow. Oh, and let us not forget that great bastion of learning, the University of Michigan. Mind you, Judge Samuel was an original benefactor. My own dear husband attended school there. Yes, indeed, Judge Samuel was quite the pioneer. Would anyone like more tea?
Lights shift.
I read that your grandfather was also a staunch abolitionist. Is that true?
He was. During the Civil War, my grandmother Millicent is said to have hired many black servants, all of whom were recently arrived, none of whom remained very long.
How interesting.
Old building plans for the hall show a secret room in the basement with hidden crawl spaces under the porches. There was even a trap door on the old south porch.
It sounds like Judge Samuel was a conductor on the Underground Railroad.
Yes, that is the story. I didn't know my grandfather. He died before I was born, but I believe I would have liked him. He followed a long tradition of Dexters who believed in standing up for the rights of others.
And then you came along and helped to change the lives of women everywhere.
Oh, there were so many of us, all working together, marching, writing, speaking, fighting. My only hope is that the work will continue after I'm... You must have other questions.
Much has been written about your marriage to Stanley McCormick.
Yes, the mad millionaire, as the world so cruelly came to know him. But my Stanley was a gentle soul, a sensitive artist who was unfortunately plagued with a serious mental illness. I'm afraid it stole his life.
Lights shift. 1903. 28-year-old Katherine enters carrying schoolbooks.
Mother! Ah, there's my Katherine. It was so lovely of you all to come, but I'm afraid now you'll have to excuse me.
Josephine turns and rolls her tea card away.
Mother, I've received another letter from Stanley. He refuses to accept that I've broken our engagement.
Katherine Dexter, I don't understand myself why you refuse to marry the poor boy. No one could ask for a better match.
I'm afraid I broke our engagement 3 times before I finally agreed to marry him.
How did you meet?
Lights shift. 1888. 13-year-old Katherine and 14-year-old Stanley awkwardly dance.
That's right. And turn gently now. Remember, your partner is a graceful debutante, not a sack of potatoes.
Goodness, I was 13 years old the first time I met Stanley McCormick. It was at Borneet's Dancing Academy in Chicago, where we both grew up.
Now, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Stanley steps on Katherine's foot.
I'm sorry, I guess I'm not very good at this.
Neither am I. Honestly, I don't see why any of this is necessary. I'm not going to be a boring debutante like my mother expects. I'm never going to marry. I'm going to be a scientist, a surgeon.
That sounds very ambitious.
It is. When I put my mind to something, I can do it. My father says I can do anything I want.
And your mother?
She'll have to come around eventually.
Mothers can be very daunting. Mine is set on my joining my father's business. She doesn't understand that I mean to be an artist.
All right, the children. I believe that's enough for today.
Will I see you here next week?
I suppose I must if I'm to keep my mother's good graces. Well, it seems to me a terrible waste of time.
Then I am glad for your mother's insistence.
Why, Stanley McCormick, you're blushing.
I will see you next week.
Young Stanley hurries away. Lights shift.
But then you left Chicago.
My father died rather suddenly. It was a terrible time.
You were close then?
He was my greatest champion. Wirt Dexter was a great believer in the rights of everyone, including women. He believed in me.
From what I found, he was very well respected.
By everyone. His funeral was small and simple, held at our home just as he requested. Yet so many people attended.
The Chicago Tribune devoted their entire first page to the passing of Wirt Dexter.
Yes. I was 14 and my brother Sam was just about to graduate Harvard.
In the background, we see Josephine, Katherine, and Sam standing before a coffin.
He was going to have very large shoes to fill, carrying on the Dexter legacy.
Sam slowly turns and walks away.
Then 4 years later, we lost him too. Spinal meningitis.
I'm so sorry.
Long before Stanley was lost to me, I'd already lost the 2 other men I loved most in the world. My beloved father and my dear brother Sam. Too much grief for a young woman to carry.
Lights shift. Young Katherine sits at a desk, writing.
What of our lives now? What kind of God would make us so unhappy?
I
I have concluded that justice seemed better served to those who took control of their own lives.
Josephine enters opposite, carrying a satchel.
Well, that's the last of our trunks off to the station.
With the Dexter family wealth, my mother and I would want for nothing. But with the loss of my father and brother, we were two women alone in the world with no social standing.
One cannot depend on faith for sustenance. Sentiment must be met with intellect to survive.
Catherine, come along now. We don't want to miss our train.
My
Catherine
mother-
puts down her pen, closes her journal, and turns out the light.
My mother had family in Boston, so we left Chicago to make a fresh start.
In the background, we see young Stanley in his dancing attire, standing alone, waiting. Finally, he turns and exits.
Boston. So that's how you ended up at MIT.
Eventually, but only after a number of dreadful years at Miss Hershey's School of Girls.
But you spoke with Harvard first.
They had just opened a new women's division.
Radcliffe College.
Yes, but when I asked to see their chemistry lab, I was told that the women did their chemistry assignments in the bathrooms.
So that was out.
MIT had proper laboratories, but women were discouraged from attending.
Lights shift. Young Catherine steps up to a male monitor seated at a desk, hands over her test booklet. He takes it without bothering to look up or acknowledge her.
I passed the exam, but was told I would have to take 3 years of rigorous preparatory classes first. Even then, there was no guarantee that I would be allowed to pursue a science degree.
Young Catherine sits at a desk, poring over a book. Josephine enters in evening attire.
It was a lovely dinner, Catherine. You were missed.
I'm sure it was, but I need to study.
Your life is passing you by while you bury yourself in your books. Most of your friends are married by now, and here you sit.
Mother, please.
Listen to me. You are an attractive, intelligent young woman. Ambitious, too, I realize. And you will find no stronger proponent of a woman's education than myself. Before I met your father, I attended college as well. I wanted to be a teacher. But a science degree?
I will need it if I'm to be a surgeon.
A surgeon? Honestly, Catherine, how will any of this advance your prospects?
Your idea of my prospects quite differ from mine.
But not of the world in which we live. Catherine Dexter, you are 21 years old. Your dear brother is gone. It is up to you now to make a good marriage, to bear children who will continue the Dexter legacy. That is your duty.
And what of the duty to myself, Mother? To my own heart? Now, if you please excuse me, I have a great deal of reading to do.
Josephine throws up her hands and walks away.
Of course, it was never just the men. My Catherine comes from a long line of strong, pioneering women as well. Her grandmother, Millicent, God rest her soul, attended me at Catherine's birth right here in Dexter, in the great Gordon Hall, having borne 8 children of her own, you see. Still, she managed to deliver the mail herself whenever Judge Dexter was in court. Why, she worked right alongside him for the whole of their marriage. I, too, worked alongside dear Mr. Dexter, Catherine's father. After the great Chicago fire, oh my, you can't imagine what it was to witness. To survive such a dreadful thing. For years after that tragic event, our home was a veritable hub for the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, which my own dear husband helped to form and direct. Wirt Dexter saw to everything, from the rebuilding of that great city to the aid and welfare of its citizens. while I served as his assistant and secretary. Oh, but that's a story for another day. Still, in the end, we were wives and mothers, and history does not record our names. It is our children who became our legacy. Stubborn though they may be.
Josephine looks back towards Catherine's room, heaves a sigh, and exits.
So your first campaign was waged against your mother.
I'm afraid it was.
So was mine, but I was determined to go to MIT.
As was I. So I completed the 3 years of preparatory study, and they finally agreed to admit me as a special student.
So basically, you were studying pre-med.
Yes, that's what they might call it today.
There are still only 20 women in my class. Back then, were you the only one?
There were a few others studying there at the time, but in 1904, no woman had ever graduated with a biology degree.
So you were the first.
First in biology, second female graduate. Now, once I was accepted, my next battle was with the chemistry department.
Light shift. 1902. Young Katherine writes.
Dear sirs, your insistence that I wear the hats of my gender while working in the science lab is not only unnecessary, but presents a danger to both myself and my fellow students. Surely you can see that the feathered hat worn in such an environment is simply a fire hazard. I refuse to comply with this ridiculous requirement. I respectfully request that the science department change the rules as pertains to the wearing of hats by women while attending any class.
Ultimately, I won, and they changed the rules. It was my first real victory.
And what about Stanley McCormick?
Dear Stanley. By then he had graduated from Princeton with honors, I might add, and had spent time in Paris studying art. But his mother, Nettie, was a force to be reckoned with, and she called him home to join the family business.
Light shift. 1903.
Stanley, you have a duty to your family.
But what of the duty to myself, Mother? To my own heart?
Stanley's father was Cyrus McCormick, who built a great fortune on the invention of the mechanical reaper.
And Stanley was part of the merger that became International Harvester.
Indeed, but by then he was already struggling.
Stanley, I'm your mother. I'm worried about you. We all are.
So I suppose there's been another family meeting about poor Stanley then. What are we going to do about Stanley? What's wrong with Stanley? Don't think I haven't asked myself the same question 100 times.
Oh, you need your rest.
Is that what you told my sister when you locked her away? That's what you're really worried about, isn't it? That I might be like Mary Virginia. God knows the mighty Cyrus McCormick wouldn't want the press reporting on another insane child. Another stain on his family's reputation.
Stop it, Stanley!
But there is something wrong with me, Mother. I can feel it. There are voices in my head. And the other day when I looked in the mirror, there was nothing there. My face, I'm disappearing, Mother.
Oh, it's just your nerves, Stanley. You're exhausted and overwrought. You're obviously under some sort of duress. Work is not helping in the way that we had hoped. We can all see that you are not well.
That's what I'm trying to tell you.
Well, the doctor thinks a change of scenery will do you good. And you know how you love to travel.
Driving does calm me.
Yes.
Get in the car, head down the road.
And not think about anything for a while. It will do you good to get away.
Yes. All right then, Mother.
You can leave in the morning.
Lights shift.
I was 28 years old, and in my final year of study at MIT, my mother and I were on a summer road trip, and one evening, while we were having dinner,
Miss Dexter.
Stanley, is that you?
You remember me?
Why, it's been...
16 years.
Mother, you'll remember Stanley McCormick.
Of course. Oh, you're Cyrus McCormick's son.
Yes, ma'am.
You know, after the great Chicago fire gutted your father's factory, it was my own dear Mr. Dexter who convinced him to stay on and rebuild in Chicago. Oh, but that was long before you children were born. Please, Mr. McCormick, won't you join us?
Thank you, but I rather hope that Miss Dexter might take a walk with me. After dinner?
Lights shift.
Suddenly he was the blushing 14-year-old boy I'd learned to dance with. We walked and talked for the next few days, and then he followed me home to Boston. Stanley courted me so eagerly. Dinners, flowers, long walks in the park. It was difficult to resist.
But you did.
At first. It frightened me how much he needed me.
Katherine, please.
His changing moods, his lack of self-esteem, his fears. It was also challenging. And I had plans of my own.
I'm sorry, Stanley, but I see no hope for us. Your behavior is so erratic. How could we ever be happy together? And with your mother's constant interference, we would never have peace.
When I broke our engagement for the third time, I needed to get away, quiet my mind, and so I decided to set sail for a family home in Switzerland. I was about to board the ship when suddenly, there on the dock, was Stanley.
Please, Kat.
But Stanley...
I need you. I need your wisdom, your strength. I fear you're the only one who can save me.
Stanley...
No, please. I love you. I have loved you ever since the day we first danced together as children. Marry me, Katherine. Marry me, and I will do better. Be better. And I will never stand in the way of your dreams.
He was so desperate. I don't know, it felt almost fated. So I finally agreed to marry him. Our engagement was announced on the day of my graduation from MIT.
Oh, Katherine! Oh, you could not have made me happier. Marriage to the son of the great Cyrus McCormick, handsome, intelligent, from a well-respected family. And now we will have an heir to the Dexter line.
Nettie screams and throws a letter across the room.
Oh! Engaged! I won't have it. My Stanley is troubled. He is not fit for marriage. He needs his mother. Only I know what is best for my son. Oh, ring! Ring for the maid! I must lie down. Engaged! Impossible!
We were married at our family estate in Switzerland, where we honeymooned for 6 months.
Please, Stanley, come to bed.
Stanley was distressed so much of the time. Not helped, I fear, by the presence of both of our mothers.
Nettie and Josephine step forward, glare at each other, then exit opposite.
He would sit at a desk till all hours of the night, scribbling I knew not what, until finally I gave up. Once we returned to the States, Stanley's nervous condition worsened and a series of hospitalizations began.
A doctor steps forward, reading a chart.
Patient Stanley McCormick, note, all the family of nervous temperament, mother eccentric.
As it turned out, all 4 of Nettie's children suffered from various psychological and mental disorders. Nettie herself was in and out of sanatoriums.
Dear Dr. Tubble, I find benefit to my nerves from electricity applied to me through the warm water of the bath given here. The electricity produced a simple pricking sensation, bath to Stanley? I mean, have you the bathtub equipped with such a battery?
Only then did I learn what a tyrant Stanley's father had been, and his mother. So obsessive and controlling.
I also have benefited from static electricity. I stand in a chair and a wire arrangement shaped just like a simple crown or cap is swung above my head and the current is turned on. It soothes. Have you appliances to give this treatment to Stanley as well?
4 years into our marriage, Stanley's episodes became severe.
We hear a siren blaring. Red lights flash across the stage.
Like his sister before him, Stanley was diagnosed with schizophrenia and committed full time.
We hear the echo of a distant door closing.
I saw to it that he was well cared for and visited as often as I could, but he would see no one. For nearly 20 years, my only contact was through letters.
Lights shift. 1910. Katherine, now aged 34.
Dear Stanley, your doctors tell me that you are doing well with the warm climate and the move to more familiar surroundings. For that I am glad, though the separation for me has been difficult.
In the background, we see a stone-faced Stanley, quietly rocking in the corner as a nurse reads him the letter.
Never one to be idle, as you well know. I am making good use of my time alone to work with NAWSA, the National American Woman Suffrage Association. I had just returned from my first field trip across the state, speaking on the importance of women winning our right to vote. Oh, Stanley, you should have seen me.
Always upon arrival in each new town, we ask the conductor to leave us in the busiest part. Can you imagine? Whereupon we find the local drugstore and ask the druggist to hold our suitcases.
Really?
The scene unfolds as Josephine reads to her luncheon guests.
Then we unfurl our banner, unpack our pamphlets, and begin distributing our literature to local shopkeepers and passers-by. Once people know that the suffragists have arrived, we set up our meetings in the evenings when people are free of work, usually in the park.
We tried everything. Hosting garden parties, joining parades, sending balloons aloft. Once, when the local police refused to let us gather on the beach, we waded into the water with our banners held high, and I spoke from the sea.
Now that I would like to have seen.
We reach about 700 people a day, and we are given a great deal of newspaper notice, most of which is not of the yellow sort. I dare say she sounds happy, for which I am glad. I do believe this work has been good for her.
I do not understand you, Josephine. How can you bear to have your daughter running around the countryside doing all of this unseemly speech-making? It is not ladylike in the least, and frankly, many of us are embarrassed by Catherine's involvement with this suffrage nonsense.
Harriet Walters, I am certainly not embarrassed by my daughter's convictions, nor should any of you be. My own dear Mr. Dexter was a great voice for the people and a supporter of all human rights, particularly the rights of women. Why should his daughter not carry on the tradition?
Well, I cannot bear to think of it. It is improper for anyone of her social status to be grandstanding in the public square. And if you cannot see that, well...
Harriet rises and leaves in a huff. Lights shift.
Unfortunately, this was not an uncommon view. We were met with a great deal of opposition, which often came from other women.
Lights shift to an anti-suffragist rally.
Ladies, we know that the majority of women want no part of this so-called movement. We do not wish to vote, nor do we need to. Voting is the responsibility of our husbands. The truth is, what these women are really advocating for is the right to free love.
Free love? The idea of rights for women were so distorted distressing to some that they took any opportunity to discredit us. They distributed brochures and pamphlets and pornographic material, harassed marchers, broke up rallies, anything to try and stop our progress.
Just like they're doing now with the women's movement.
Yes, and I'm afraid that feminist has been turned into a dirty word the same way that suffragist was maligned in my day.
I don't get it. We're demonized for wanting equal rights, equal pay for equal work, and control of our own bodies. The same right that every man has always taken for granted. Does nothing ever change?
That's why we fought so hard for the vote, so that we could effect change for ourselves.
And that alone took generations.
More than 100 years. And even at that, suffrage passed with a one-vote margin. We can never afford to take anything for granted.
Dear Catherine, I sense great passion and confidence from your letters, which makes me proud. But while I admire your courage and commitment to this most just cause, there are those among us who are less understanding. I do wish you could find a way to be a little less conspicuous. Possibly you could be just as effective from behind the scenes.
Unfortunately, my involvement with the suffrage debate brought unwanted attention from all sides. Suddenly, my personal life was making headlines in all the papers.
Stanley McCormick insane, a prisoner.
Wife comes to visit but cannot see him.
Wife of mad millionaire fights psychoanalyst for maniac husband's love and guardianship.
Love is loyal, hope is gone.
It was the start of the Great Depression, and yet the press covered our court case more than they did the stock market crash. It's infuriating.
They make me out to be the grieving woman who has sacrificed her life, who suffers in silence over her unfortunate marriage to poor Stanley McCormick. They mention nothing of my work with the suffrage movement, that while I manage the business affairs of my husband, I have also carried on with a full and meaningful life.
You knew he was ill, but you still married him.
I loved him. And Stanley earnestly believed that I was the only one who could save him. Not that I didn't try. I was convinced that there was a physical connection to his condition, that the endocrine system was somehow involved. But none of the doctors, nor his family, would take me seriously. I spent decades in court fighting a host of medical specialists who saw him as their experiment.
And you fought his mother.
Nettie wanted complete control of Stanley, body, mind, and soul.
Another fight you chose to undertake.
His family wanted me to divorce Stanley. They even offered to buy me out as if money was an issue. Or that my husband's life could be made into some sort of business transaction. The pressure came from all sides, the families, the doctors, the lawyers, even my own mother.
Catherine, what if you took their offer and divorced him after all? This is no kind of marriage. Not with Stanley locked away with a team of caretakers, and you all on your own. There is still time for you to make a proper marriage and bear children who will carry on the Dexter line.
Mother, you don't understand. Stanley needs my protection. I could never abandon him.
How did the trial finally end?
A will was discovered among Stanley's papers. He had written it on the night of our marriage, sitting at the desk, scribbling away, already fighting for the control of his mind.
Let it be known that should anything happen to me, I leave everything to my beloved Katherine.
And that was the end of that.
Still, you gave up so much.
It was not the life I had planned for myself. But life often has a way of ignoring our plans. You'll see that when you're older.
In the background, we see Katherine sitting at Stanley's bedside. holding his hand.
It's been 20 years since my Stanley passed away. After all the years of turmoil, all the struggles and pain, I was struck by how peaceful it all was. How quietly he left us.
Lights fade.
But I'm sure you didn't come all this way to talk about Stanley McCormick.
I find myself at a loss for words now.
It's all right. Go on. It's what we women must do, isn't it? Go on.
Okay then. Your work with Margaret Say.
Margaret was my dear friend for more than 30 years. Her passing last September was
A great loss to all of us.
indeed. Mrs. Sanger and I shared the same dream in our youth, to be doctors. I often wonder, had we been allowed, what we might have accomplished.
Oh, but you did so much.
Not nearly enough, I'm afraid. Progress is slow. Though I suppose we've come a ways from the days of the Comstock Law. Back then, Mrs. Sanger, a well-respected nurse, was jailed for simply telling women how to prevent another pregnancy.
The idea that information about our own bodies could be made illegal.
But a doctor telling a husband to simply sleep on the roof was acceptable birth control advice.
It's unimaginable.
Is it?
I hope so.
Don't be too sure. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's always been that way for women. Back then, we had to be resourceful.
Lights shift. 1922. We hear the sound of a ship's horn blasting as Katherine enters customs.
May I see your passport, ma'am?
Katherine dutifully hands it over.
Thank you, Mrs. McCormick.
Yes,
Where are you traveling from?
Paris, France.
These are your trunks?
That's correct. There are 7.
In the background, another officer opens several of the trunks, looks inside, then gives the all-clear signal.
Do you have anything to declare?
No, only that I bought far too many dresses this trip.
Unamused, he hands back her passport.
Thank you, ma'am. You may go through.
Lights shift.
7 trunks of dresses?
And coats. You see, unlike America, contraception was legal in Europe. What the customs officer didn't realize was that the linings of all my new couture were filled with diaphragms.
Illegal contraband?
Yes, more than 1,000 of them. Which Mrs. Sanger then quietly dispensed in her clinic.
But how did...
I used my biology training and my knowledge of language to pose as a foreign scientist.
And you weren't afraid of being discovered?
I admit that it was all a bit daring, and there were moments when I was sure that I would be found out. But I was able to order large quantities of contraceptive devices from various manufacturers in Germany and France. I had them all shipped to my family's chateau. Then I hired seamstresses to sew everything into the linings of all my new clothing. Customs never suspected a thing.
That's brilliant.
I made quite a few crossings in those days and bought a great deal too many dresses.
What a story.
We do what we must.
That certainly hasn't changed.
But Mrs. Sanger and I both felt that a simpler, safer method of birth control was needed, like a pill.
And it's because of your work that we finally have one.
Well, for married women at least. The next step is to legalize contraception for all women, regardless of marital status.
Do you think that will happen?
It must. Until we have reproductive choice, the ability to decide for ourselves if and when to be pregnant, women will never be allowed to reach their full potential.
It seems so obvious.
Motherhood is an honorable role, to be sure, but it occupies such a short term in the span of a woman's life.
And why shouldn't we be allowed to contribute to society in other meaningful ways as well?
And that, my dear, is why the fight must continue.
A harried attorney suddenly enters and approaches Lauren.
I'm so sorry to keep you waiting.
No,
It's a shame you came all this way for nothing.
I don't understand.
She turns to Katherine, who is no longer there.
Forgive me, I'm Catherine's attorney. I'm sorry to inform you that Mrs. McCormick passed away early this morning.
But we were just... I have all these notes.
I understand. I was quite saddened to hear it myself. Mrs. McCormick was an extraordinary woman. She's left quite a legacy.
But
Come, I'll take you back to the train myself.
Confused, Lauren follows the attorney off, looking back at the bench for only a moment. As she exits, young Stanley and Katherine step out of the shadows, dressed in their dancing attire. Young Stanley offers his hand, Katherine takes it, and the two dance off together. Lights shift as the ensemble steps forward.
Katherine Dexter McCormick's obituaries were printed in the Boston newspaper.
The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune,
And the Los Angeles Times.
they all recognized her as the daughter of Wirt Dexter, prominent Chicago attorney.
The wife of Stanley McCormick.
The youngest son of millionaire inventor Cyrus McCormick.
a rich, eccentric widow who was left to dispense her dead husband's money.
No mention was made of the years she spent seeking a cure for Stanley.
Which resulted in her founding the Neuroendocrine Research Foundation at Harvard Medical School.
Which gave rise to evidence long after her death that confirmed her belief in a connection between schizophrenia and the endocrine system.
They listed her graduation from MIT.
Her building of a woman's dormitory there in honor of her husband.
Which tripled the number of women able to attend MIT and study the sciences.
And her donations of art to various institutions.
There was no mention of the $5 million she left to Stanford University to assist women who were seeking a medical degree.
Missing almost entirely was an account of her more than 6 decades of work to secure the rights of women.
The right to an equal education.
The right to vote.
Her co-founding the League of Women Voters with Carrie Chapman Catt,
Or her fight for the right to safe and legal birth control.
Nothing was said of her work with Sanger to bring about an oral contraceptive.
The pill.
Or the fact that Katherine headed the research process herself.
or that she single-handedly funded its research and development.
At a time when large foundations were reluctant to touch the subject.
With a government that was hands-off for political reasons.
There was no mention of her efforts to legalize oral contraception.
Something which the New York Times called the most sweeping socio-medical revolution in history.
Her efforts to see that women be included in the U.S. Constitution,
Through the passage of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment,
Continued until her death in 1967.
Today, in 2024, the ERA has still not been ratified.
as women's rights, reproductive rights, are once again being stripped away.
2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that, my dear, is why the fight must continue.
Katherine Dexter McCormick. Oh yes, she was quite the pioneer.
The end.
Thanks for coming, and thanks to this wonderful cast and the director, Dan Cooney, and our playwright, Dale Ann Hunt. Just a reminder, we have the response forms in your programs, and if you take a moment to fill out those and answer those questions, we really appreciate it. It will help with the development of the play. We have a few minutes. They're going to be doing Oklahoma right here on this stage in just a short time. So we'll just have a few minutes. If anyone has any questions about the play, about the process, anything, please raise your hand.
We have our playwright, Dale Ann Hunt, here. She would be more than willing to answer questions. Come on up, Dale Ann.
Cheryl Willoughby over here, a member of the committee who brought this topic to Gail and Hunt's attention. And we're really, really, I don't think this would exist if Cheryl had not.
I would just mention, thank you to Cheryl for making all of this happen. And honestly, I studied women's history at New York University and never heard Katherine Dexter, McCormick's name, which says everything, I think, until Cheryl brought her up to us. So thank you. It's an important story.
Absolutely. Well, if we don't, I don't see any questions. It's hard for me to see.
One back here in the corner.
Oh, okay.
So I had a few questions. Amazing woman. Did she actually have a career? She did all these amazing things, but did she have a specific profession while she was, navigating all the research and all the innovations and her husband mental health?
She was what they called rich, like really rich. And so she was able to work on things that were her passion rather than having a career.
Dale, and you know if you actually had a career? That was the question.
There were really not women in the professions at that time. That was part of the problem. I mean, that really happened in the 80s. That really way past. So no, there were few women working in any kind of profession, and generally not at the level they should have been. But because of the money, people had to listen to her. She and Sanger picked the two doctors to implement the research on the pill because they were not allowed to be doctors. But these poor men, they controlled everything. And much has been written about them and not anything really about Katherine. So it's interesting.
I have a question for you. Were there things that the play brought up for you that you'd like to see more about? Was there anything that was hinted at that you thought maybe I'd like to know more about that, and there should be more of it in the play? Yes.
I already wrote this note on the back, but I loved learning about how she was actually involved with the research and development of the pill, based on her knowledge and study. So I know this wasn't the whole play, but if there was a bit more of her in the lab, I feel like we could really connect to her as a scientist.
Great.
And that would be just a super cool part of her to focus on. I know it's hard.
No, it's great.
But thank you.
I see there's a question back there.
I just wondered how do you envision the staging going ahead? What do you picture? How's this going to lay out?
Can't quite hear the question. One more time, please.
I just said how's the staging? What are you thinking about staging? What's the set's going to be like?
Well, I don't think it's anywhere near that place. This was just a read to hear the text and plot points. There hasn't been any discussion or designers involved yet.
I have one. Up here. Having read some of the material, I know that there were some interesting and probably relevant things that happened to Katherine around Samuel's illness. One of them being that she was blamed for it. There was quite a lot of medical opinion that said that okay, if he's sick, that's her fault.
Oh, Stanley, you mean?
Yeah, sorry, Stanley.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And the rumors that were started and circulated around her because she didn't, have a man, and she hung around mostly with women and things of that nature. And so, do you have a thought to include any of that?
Sure, at some point when we can expand this, of course it was her fault. She was too strong, and that's why Stanley was sick. And that's very commonly done.
That's why they wouldn't let her see him.
But he would not see anyone for a long time.
Yeah.
But she would go. She actually moved. They actually bought an estate, Rivenbach, the family did, which is where Megan and Harry are living now. Actually, they bought it in California, and they bought caretakers, hired them, and he lived there for all the rest of his life. On good days when he was lucid, he would play golf with his caretakers, and he would do charcoal drawings. He was a talented artist. And on psychotic days, they would have to tracked him down. He was, uneven. But towards the end of his life, he got much better, much calmer, and she was with him. She moved to be closer to the estate so that she could see him as often as she could.
I saw a question down here.
Just I guess clarification. She was born in Gordon Hall in Dexter,
Yes.
and I missed how she ended up growing up in Chicago.
They moved. Wirt Dexter was a famous Chicago attorney, and when Josephine was ready to deliver, she came back to Gordon Hall to have the baby and spent several months there so that Millicent could help her with the delivery.
Louder, the only a little unclear.
Louder.
The only
Oh, louder, oh, sorry. Gosh, nobody's ever said that to me before.
Stage voice.
Point from the local historian.
Yes.
The Chicago fire was in 1871, and there was much problems there, and I believe that is the reason they came by train since she was born here.
Oh, that could very well be. Thank you. I'll look at that.
We have 2 more hands up, then we have to get set up for Oklahoma in the center here. We have one question, then one in the back row, and then we'll have to wrap up. Thank you, friends.
I just want to thank you guys. That was fantastic. We'll like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because it's my own TV
Timely, isn't it?
watching it, and I think it's really pertinent. I was curious. I think there's been more controversy in the recent years about Margaret Sanger and eugenics movement, and how that may have played into her advocacy for contraception. And it sounds like the McCormick Dexters were very pro, like, just equality and abolitionists and that sort of stuff. And I was just curious if we could maybe touch on that controversy.
I didn't hear the last part of that, but I will tell you that when I went to NYU, my history professor was the curator of the Sanger papers, and she actually published 3 volumes of them. I have all of the letters. You can read all the letters between Sanger and Katherine.
Yeah.
And I had brought the eugenics question up to her when I was in school, and she was like, no, it's completely a misinterpretation of what they were trying to do. But they did have a concern about birth rates around the world and poverty.
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
sure.
I think it'd be nice to touch on that in there too.
Yeah.
Maybe diminish some of that controversy, or not.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay, good.
And our last question from the back?
Question here in the center. There's one more after this. Go ahead.
Well, Catherine Dexter McCormick needs to be famous. I know this is a good first step, but what do you foresee to elevate her in history?
Spread the information any way we can. Share. It's really tragic that we don't know her name, isn't it? Yeah.
And our final question here in the back.
Was Catherine a religious person? And if so, did she push similar progressive sort of movements in the church?
Was Catherine a religious person?
No,
and did
not
she
that
push
I'm aware
progressive movements in the church?
Not aware of any religious connection with her or her work. No.
Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you for filling out the forms. I've been asked to remind you that they do need the space in the parking lot for incoming patrons of Oklahoma. So if you please don't leave your cars there. Please take your cars away with you, and thank you very much for coming.